In the depths of space, where ancient civilizations rise and fall like cosmic tides, there exists a trial so impossible that it has become legend. For 3,000 years, the Draconic Empire's most sacred tradition has remained unbroken. Only those who pass the trial of eternal flame may claim noble titles and rule over star systems. Princes have died attempting it. Generals have gone mad. The greatest minds in the galaxy have been reduced to ash and memory. Yet every generation, the hopeful gather on the crystalline world of Pyraxis, believing they might be the one to succeed where countless others have failed. But what happens when even the most promising candidates crumble before the trial's impossible demands? What happens when the Dragon Lady herself, the immortal empress who has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, must choose between tradition and survival? The answer lies not in the halls of power or the academies of the elite, but in a cramped dormitory room where a human exchange student sits alone, eating instant noodles and failing his xenobiology classes. Marcus Chen never expected to save an empire. He just wanted to pass his exams and go home. Sometimes, the galaxy's greatest hope comes from its most unlikely source. The story that follows will challenge everything you think you know about power, wisdom, and what it truly means to be noble. The crystalline spires of Pyraxis gleamed like frozen fire against the three-sun sky, their surfaces reflecting the heat signatures of the assembled multitude below. 12 noble claimants stood in perfect formation within the circle of judgment, each representing bloodlines that stretched back millennia, each carrying the hopes of entire star systems on their shoulders. Marcus Chen watched from the observation deck of the Academy Exchange Dormitory, his half-eaten bowl of synthetic ramen growing cold in his hands. The human exchange student had originally planned to spend the day catching up on his xenobiology homework, but the commotion outside had drawn him to the window. Below, what looked like half the galaxy had gathered to witness the trial of eternal flame. Still watching the pageantry, human? Marcus turned to find Zixtal, his Vorthan roommate, entering their shared quarters. The insectoid alien's mandibles clicked with what Marcus had learned to recognize as amusement. Zixtal's compound eyes reflected the light from the ceremonial fires below as he approached the window. "Hard not to," Marcus replied, setting down his bowl. "They've been preparing for this for months. The whole planet's basically shut down." "As it should be," Zixtal said, his translator rendering his clicks and whistles into galactic standard. "This trial hasn't been passed in over 3 centuries. If one of these nobles succeeds today, they'll essentially become the Dragon Lady's heir apparent." Marcus knew the basics of Draconic Empire politics from his mandatory cultural orientation courses, but the details still seemed fantastical to him. The Dragon Lady, whose real name was apparently unpronounceable in most languages, had ruled the empire for over 3,000 years. She was the last of the true dragons, beings of such immense power and longevity that they were considered living gods by most of the galaxy. What exactly makes this trial so impossible? Marcus asked, watching as the 12 nobles began their ritual preparations. Zixtal's antennae twitched. "No one knows for certain. The trial takes place in the sanctum of binding flame, deep beneath the planet's core. Those who enter either emerge as acknowledged nobles with the Dragon Lady's blessing, or they don't emerge at all." Through the window, Marcus could see the nobles more clearly now. There was Prince Valerian of the Stellar Reach, whose golden armor seemed to absorb and amplify the light around him. Duchess Seraphina the Bold stood next to him, her cybernetic enhancements gleaming as she ran final diagnostics. General Thaddeus Rex, the war hero who had single-handedly ended the Andromedan rebellion, checked his plasma weaponry with mechanical precision. Each of the 12 was a legend in their own right. Marcus had studied some of their accomplishments in his political science electives. Prince Valerian had negotiated the Peace of 7 Worlds. Duchess Seraphina had pioneered quantum jump technology. General Rex had tactics named after him in military academies across the empire. "They all look so confident," Marcus observed. "They always do," Zixtal replied. "Confidence is rarely the issue. The trial doesn't test strength or intelligence in any conventional sense." Before Marcus could ask what that meant, a deep vibration shook the building. The ceremonial horns of the Draconic Guard were sounding, their resonance designed to be felt in one's bones rather than simply heard. Far below, the crowd of billions fell silent as a figure emerged from the central tower. Even from this distance, the Dragon Lady's presence was unmistakable. She moved with a fluid grace that seemed to bend reality around her, her form shifting between the appearance of a tall, elegant humanoid woman and something far more primal and powerful. Ancient scales caught the light along her arms and neck, and her eyes glowed with an inner fire that had burned since before Marcus's entire species had developed written language. "She looks smaller than I expected," Marcus said without thinking. Zixtal's mandibles clicked rapidly, the Vorthan equivalent of laughter. "Size means nothing to her kind. She could level this city with a thought if she chose to." The dragon lady raised one hand, and her voice carried across the entire planet through psychic amplification rather than technology. Every being on Pyraxis heard her words directly in their mind, translated instantly into their native language. "Children of the stars," she began, and Marcus felt the weight of millennia in those words. "For 3 centuries, this trial has remained unconquered. Today, 12 of our finest gather to attempt what none before them have achieved. They seek not just noble titles, but the right to help guide an empire that spans 1,000,000 worlds." The 12 nobles stepped forward in unison, each placing their hand on the crystalline altar at the center of the circle. As they did so, the altar began to glow, and the ground beneath them started to descend, revealing a passage that led deep into the planet's core. "Should they succeed," the Dragon Lady continued, "they will emerge with wisdom and power beyond mortal comprehension. Should they fail..." She paused, and, in that silence, Marcus could feel the weight of all those who had never returned. "Then, we continue our vigil, as we have for centuries past." Prince Valerian stepped forward as the apparent leader of the group. Even from this distance, Marcus could see the nobility in his bearing, the absolute certainty that radiated from every gesture. "Great Mother," he called out, using the formal address for the Dragon Lady, "we go gladly into the trial, knowing that our success will secure the future of the Empire for generations to come." The Dragon Lady nodded, an expression that might have been approval or resignation crossing her ancient features. "Then, go, noble ones. Face the trial that has humbled emperors and broken the minds of the greatest warriors our galaxy has known." The 12 nobles descended into the passage, their forms disappearing into the golden light that emanated from the depths. The entrance sealed itself behind them with the finality of a tomb, leaving only the altar's gentle glow to mark where they had gone. "How long does it usually take?" Marcus asked. "Varies," Zixtal replied. "Sometimes minutes, sometimes hours. The record is 3 days, though that claimant emerged, changed. He spent the rest of his life speaking only in mathematical equations." The crowd below had not dispersed. If anything, more beings seemed to be arriving by the hour, gathering in the parks and plazas around the ceremonial ground. Marcus could see the shimmer of news drones in the air, broadcasting the vigil to every corner of the empire. Hours passed. Marcus tried to return to his studies, but found himself constantly drawn back to the window. Zixtal had given up any pretense of studying and had positioned himself at the observation post with a bag of his favorite fermented beetle snacks. The first sign that something was wrong came 6 hours into the vigil. The altar's steady glow began to flicker, and a subsonic vibration started emanating from deep beneath the planet's surface. The Dragon Lady, who had remained motionless on her platform for the entire duration, suddenly tensed. "That's not good," Zixtal muttered, his compound eyes tracking the Dragon Lady's movements. The flickering grew more pronounced, and now Marcus could hear something, not sound, exactly, but a resonance that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and speak directly to some primitive part of his brain. It was the sound of something breaking, something fundamental and irreplaceable being damaged beyond repair. The Dragon Lady moved then, her form blurring as she crossed the ceremonial ground in a single step. She placed both hands on the altar, and Marcus saw her ancient features contract with what could only be described as pain. "What's happening down there?" someone in the crowd shouted, but the Dragon Lady didn't respond. Instead, she closed her eyes and began to glow with the same golden light that had marked the passage. For several long minutes, the light grew brighter and more intense, until even the three-sun sky seemed dim by comparison. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The altar went dark. The subsonic vibration ceased. And, in the sudden silence that followed, 12 figures began to emerge from the passage. Marcus felt his breath catch as he recognized them, or rather, what was left of them. Prince Valerian appeared first, but the golden armor that had gleamed so magnificently hours earlier was now tarnished and cracked. His eyes, which had burned with noble purpose, were now vacant and staring. He walked like a man in a dream, each step uncertain and disconnected. Duchess Serafina followed, her cybernetic enhancements sparking and failing. The technology that had made her one of the most capable beings in the galaxy was now actively fighting against itself, creating a grotesque display of self-destruction that she seemed powerless to stop. One by one, the rest emerged, each bearing the unmistakable marks of minds that had been stretched beyond their breaking point. General Rex's tactical genius had been replaced by a compulsive need to count. Marcus could see him numbering each step, each breath, as if the act of quantification was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. The crowd below had fallen into horrified silence. This was not the noble failure that sometimes marked unsuccessful trials. This was something far worse, a systematic dismantling of everything that had made these beings exceptional. The Dragon Lady stood at the altar, her ancient features contorted with what Marcus was shocked to realize was grief. She had witnessed this trial for millennia, had seen countless nobles fail, but this was different. "Children," she called out, her psychic voice now barely a whisper that nonetheless reached every mind on the planet. "I am sorry. I am so very sorry." Prince Valerian turned toward her voice, but his eyes couldn't seem to focus. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the certainty and power that had marked his earlier proclamation. "Great Mother," he said, the words slurred and uncertain, I remember golden light. And screaming. Was someone screaming? The Dragon Lady's grief was replaced by something harder and more terrible: anger. Not at the nobles, but at the trial itself, at the cosmic forces that demanded such prices be paid for power. "Take them to the healing chambers," she commanded, and immediately the Draconic Guard moved to escort the broken nobles away. "See that they receive every care, every comfort we can provide." As the ceremonial ground emptied, Marcus found himself still watching the Dragon Lady. The ancient being stood alone at the altar, her hand resting on the darkened crystal. For the first time since he had arrived on Paraxis, she looked truly old, not just ancient, but tired in a way that suggested the weight of millennia was finally beginning to tell. "She's going to have to make a choice," Zixtal said quietly. "What do you mean?" "The Empire needs an heir. It's not just tradition, there are cosmic forces at work here, binding spells that require a successor to maintain the balance of power across the galaxy. If she can't find someone to pass the trial..." Zixtal's mandibles clicked nervously. "Well, let's just say that the collapse of the Draconic Empire would make the last galactic war look like a minor disagreement." Marcus watched as the Dragon Lady finally turned away from the altar, her form shifting and wavering as if she were struggling to maintain coherent shape. As she walked back toward the central tower, Marcus caught something in her posture, a resignation that spoke of options running out and time growing short. "How many more chances does she get?" Marcus asked. "Technically? As many as she wants. But, practically?" Zixtal's antennae drooped. "After what happened today, who's going to volunteer? Those 12 weren't just powerful, they were the best the Empire had to offer. If they couldn't succeed, the implication hung in the air between them. If beings like Prince Valerian and Duchess Serafina couldn't pass the trial, then perhaps no one could. Perhaps the Draconic Empire was destined to die with its last empress, leaving a power vacuum that would tear the galaxy apart. Marcus found himself thinking about that as the day wore on and the crowds below slowly dispersed. The idea that something so vast and enduring could simply end seemed almost incomprehensible. The Draconic Empire had been a constant throughout galactic history, a stabilizing force that had prevented countless wars and maintained trade routes across impossible distances. What would happen to the billions of beings who depended on that stability? What would happen to students like himself, attending academies funded by imperial grants? What would happen to entire civilizations that had grown up under the protection of the Dragon Lady's power? As night fell on Pyraxis, Marcus saw lights beginning to flicker in the central tower where the Dragon Lady made her residence. Through the transparent aluminum walls, he caught glimpses of movement, the ancient being pacing back and forth like a caged predator, her frustration and desperation palpable even at this distance. "She's looking for alternatives," Zixtal observed, following Marcus's gaze. "Trying to find some other way to ensure the Empire's continuity." "What are her options?" "Not many. She could try to modify the trial somehow, but the cosmic forces that govern it aren't easily changed. She could attempt to rule indefinitely without an heir, but that would require her to remain constantly active in governing, something she's been trying to step back from for centuries. Or, Zixtal's compound eyes reflected the tower lights as he considered. Or she could do something unprecedented. Something that's never been tried in the 3,000 years of the trial's existence. Marcus was about to ask what that might be when a new light appeared in the tower, not the steady glow of normal illumination, but something that pulsed with the same golden energy that had marked the trial passage. It was accompanied by a low humming that seemed to resonate through the planet's crust itself. "What's she doing up there?" "I think," Zixtal said slowly, "she's preparing to break some very old rules." The light continued to pulse throughout the night, growing stronger as the hours passed. By morning, it was visible even in the three-sun daylight, a beacon of power that announced to the entire galaxy that something momentous was about to occur. Marcus woke to find news drones swarming around the tower like metallic insects, their sensors focused on the source of the mysterious energy. The news feeds were full of speculation, but no official word had come from the Dragon Lady herself. It wasn't until midday that the announcement finally came, delivered not through the usual channels but as a direct psychic broadcast to every sentient being on the planet, citizens of the Empire. The Dragon Lady's voice resonated in their minds, carrying undertones of determination and desperate hope. The trial has remained unconquered for too long. Traditional approaches have failed, and our greatest nobles have paid prices that should never have been demanded of them. The energy pulse from the tower intensified, and Marcus could feel something changing in the very air around him. Therefore, the Dragon Lady continued, "I am invoking the right of final choosing. The trial will be open to all beings, regardless of noble birth or political station. Any who wish to attempt it may do so, but know this, the trial remains unchanged. It will demand everything you are and more." The implications of this announcement hit Marcus like a physical blow. The right of final choosing was something he'd read about in ancient historical texts, a provision that allowed the Dragon Lady to open the trial to anyone in times of extreme crisis. It hadn't been used since the founding of the Empire itself. "She's getting desperate," Zixtal said, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "Opening the trial to everyone means she expects most attempts to fail. She's hoping that somewhere in the billions of beings in the Empire, there might be someone with the specific combination of traits needed to succeed." Marcus looked down at the ceremonial ground, where a new crowd was already gathering. But this wasn't the orderly assembly of nobles from the day before. This was chaos beings from every corner of the Empire, representing every species and social class, all suddenly possessed of the opportunity to claim power beyond imagination. "It's going to be a disaster," Marcus muttered. "Probably," Zixtal agreed. "But what choice does she have? Let the Empire collapse, or try everything possible to save it?" As they watched, the first volunteers began to approach the altar. Marcus counted at least 50 different species in the initial group, from hulking Krogan warriors to delicate ethereal philosophers. The diversity was staggering, but so was the obvious desperation that drove them forward. The Dragon Lady appeared at her platform once more, but now Marcus could see the toll the past day had taken on her. Her form was less stable, shifting more frequently between human and draconic aspects. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of exhaustion that 3 millennia of rule had never quite managed to instill. "The trial begins again," she announced. "May fortune favor those brave enough to risk everything for the future of us all." The first group of volunteers descended into the passage, and Marcus felt his stomach clench with anticipatory dread. If beings like Prince Valerian couldn't survive the trial intact, what chance did these hopefuls have? The answer came more quickly than anyone expected. Less than an hour after the first group descended, the altar began to flicker with that same ominous light that had marked the previous day's disaster. This time, when the survivors emerged, there were only 3 of them. And they were screaming. The screaming had stopped by the time the medical teams reached the 3 survivors, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. Marcus watched from his dormitory window as the emergency responders worked frantically around figures that barely qualified as conscious anymore. The first survivor was a Centaurian merchant who had apparently volunteered in hopes of gaining trading privileges across the Empire. Now he sat in perfect stillness, his forearms moving in precise, repetitive patterns that served no apparent purpose. The second was a young Terran woman, one of the few other humans on Pyraxis, whose eyes had turned completely white. She spoke continuously in a language that the universal translators couldn't identify, possibly because it wasn't actually a language at all. The third survivor was the most disturbing. A Vorthan philosopher named Kethmori, whom Zixtal recognized from the university, had emerged from the trial with his consciousness apparently intact but his perception of reality fundamentally altered. He kept insisting that everyone around him was speaking backward, and that time was flowing in the wrong direction. "This is getting worse each time," Zixtal observed, his compound eyes tracking the medical teams as they carefully transported the survivors to emergency care facilities. "Whatever's happening down there, it's becoming more destructive." Marcus nodded absently, his attention focused on the Dragon Lady's reaction to the disaster. The ancient being stood motionless at her platform, but her form was flickering more rapidly now, as if her control over her physical manifestation was breaking down under stress. "She can't keep doing this," Marcus said. "At this rate, she'll run out of volunteers before anyone succeeds." "Will she, though?" Zixtal asked. "Look at the crowd." Marcus turned his attention to the ceremonial ground and felt his heart sink. Despite what had just happened, despite the clear evidence that the trial was destroying everyone who attempted it, the crowd was larger than ever. Beings from across the Empire continued to arrive, many of them carrying crude weapons or makeshift equipment that they apparently believed would help them succeed where others had failed. "Desperation," Zixtal explained. "Half of these beings are here because their worlds are facing economic collapse or political instability. They're gambling that the slim chance of success is worth the almost certain destruction." "And the other half?" "Glory seekers and fanatics. Beings who think they're somehow special enough to survive what princes and generals could not." As they watched, another group began to assemble at the altar. This batch looked even less promising than the first, a mix of young beings barely out of adolescence and older ones whose best years were clearly behind them. Marcus recognized the look in their eyes from his economics classes, the desperate irrationality of people who had already lost everything and saw this as their only chance to gain something back. The Dragon Lady's voice reached them again through psychic transmission, but now it carried undertones of something Marcus had never expected to hear from such a powerful being: uncertainty. "The trial remains open to all who would attempt it," she said, but her words lacked the conviction of her earlier pronouncements. "However, I urge caution. What lies beneath requires more than courage or determination." A young Andromedan in the crowd shouted a question that somehow carried through the psychic link: "Great Mother, what exactly does the trial test? If we knew what we faced, perhaps we could prepare better." For a long moment, the Dragon Lady was silent. When she finally responded, her words carried the weight of ancient secrets reluctantly revealed. "The trial tests your capacity to remain yourself when confronted with absolute truth," she said. "It shows you not just what you are, but what you could become under any possible circumstance. It reveals every choice you might make, every path you might take, across all possible realities. Most minds cannot contain such knowledge without fracturing." The crowd below stirred uneasily, but Marcus noticed that no one left. If anything, some beings seemed more determined than before. The successful candidate must be able to see infinite possibilities and still maintain a coherent sense of self, the Dragon Lady continued. They must be able to hold contradictory truths simultaneously without losing their fundamental identity. It is not a test of strength or intelligence, but of something far more rare: the ability to remain stable in the face of cosmic perspective. Marcus found himself thinking about that description as the second group of volunteers descended into the trial passage. What would it be like to see every possible version of yourself simultaneously? How could anyone's mind survive that kind of revelation? The answer came 40 minutes later when the altar flickered again and 5 figures emerged from the depths. 3 of them had apparently died during the trial. Their bodies moved, but their life signs were so weak that the medical scanners could barely detect them. The other 2 had survived physically but were clearly no longer the beings they had been when they entered. "This has to stop," Marcus said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. Zixtal's mandibles clicked in agreement. "The Dragon Lady knows it. Look at her." Marcus looked up at the platform and saw that his roommate was right. The Dragon Lady's form was now shifting almost constantly, cycling between human and draconic aspects so rapidly that she appeared to be vibrating. Her ancient features were contorted with an expression of agony that spoke of impossible choices and diminishing options. "She's going to have to make a decision soon," Zixtal continued. "Either find some other way to ensure the Empire's continuity, or watch it collapse when she's finally forced to acknowledge that no one can pass this trial." Before Marcus could respond, an alarm began sounding from the central tower, not the ceremonial horns used for official announcements, but the harsh, urgent tone reserved for genuine emergencies. Moments later, the Dragon Lady's psychic voice reached them with an undertone of barely controlled panic. "All citizens are advised to remain in their current locations. Long-range sensors have detected a void kraken approaching the outer system. Estimated time to planetary arrival, 72 hours. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Void krakens were the stuff of nightmares, massive entities that existed in the spaces between realities, feeding on the psychic energy of entire civilizations. They were attracted to sources of cosmic power, and a planet hosting the trial of eternal flame would be like a beacon to such creatures." "That's it," Zixtal said grimly. "That's why she's so desperate to find an heir. A void kraken can only be fought by someone wielding the full power of the draconic bloodline. Can't she fight it herself? Normally, yes. But she's been maintaining this trial for centuries, constantly channeling cosmic forces to keep it stable. She's weakened herself to the point where facing a void kraken alone would be." Zixtal paused, his mandibles clicking rapidly as he processed the implications. "It would likely destroy her." Marcus looked down at the ceremonial ground, where the news of the approaching threat had sent the crowd into chaos. Some beings were fleeing toward the spaceports, hoping to escape the system before the creature arrived. Others were pressing forward more urgently toward the altar, apparently believing that their best chance of survival lay in somehow passing the trial before the kraken reached them. 72 hours, Marcus repeated. "How many more groups can attempt the trial in that time? At the current pace? Maybe 20 or 30. But, after what we've seen..." Zixtal's antennae drooped. "Even if someone miraculously succeeds, will they be in any condition to fight a cosmic entity?" The question hung between them as they watched another group of volunteers descend into the trial passage. This batch included what appeared to be a family unit, beings who had apparently decided to face the trial together rather than risk separation. Marcus couldn't decide if that was touching or horrifying. The results came back 30 minutes later, one survivor, catatonic and unresponsive to all stimuli. As the day progressed, the pattern continued. Groups descended, individuals emerged broken or not at all. The Dragon Lady remained at her platform, her form becoming increasingly unstable as she channeled more and more power into maintaining the trial's integrity. The approaching void kraken dominated every newsfeed, its massive form now visible through telescopic arrays as a dark smudge against the starfield. By evening, Marcus had watched 14 separate groups attempt the trial. The best result had been 2 survivors who retained basic motor functions but seemed incapable of recognizing their own names. The worst had been a group of 7 that had emerged as a single, writhing mass of partially merged consciousness that the medical teams were still trying to separate. "I can't watch this anymore," Marcus said, turning away from the window. "It's not heroic, it's just systematic destruction of anyone brave enough to try." Zixtal didn't respond immediately. When Marcus looked at his roommate, he found the Vorthan staring intently at something on his datapad. "What are you looking at?" "Research," Zixtal replied. "I've been trying to understand what makes this trial so impossible. The Dragon Lady said it shows you every possible version of yourself, right? Well, I've been thinking about that." Marcus sat down on his bunk, grateful for any distraction from the ongoing disaster outside. "And most beings define themselves through their choices and experiences," Zixtal explained, his translator rendering his excitement as rapid clicks and whistles. "We are what we are because of the specific path we've taken through life. But what if you suddenly saw every path you could have taken? What if you experienced being a villain and a hero, a coward and a warrior, a genius and a fool, all simultaneously? Your sense of self would collapse," Marcus said, beginning to understand. "Exactly. Because your identity is based on the assumption that you are one specific thing, not every possible thing. The trial doesn't just show you these alternatives based on what the Dragon Lady described, it makes you experience them as equally real and valid.
Marcus thought about that for a moment.
So the only way to survive would be to have a sense of self that doesn't depend on specific experiences or choices.
Right.
You'd need an identity so fundamental that it couldn't be shaken by discovering that you were simultaneously every possible version of yourself. Zixtal's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. The problem is, I can't think of many beings who have that kind of absolute core identity. Before Marcus could respond, another alarm sounded from the central tower. This time, the Dragon Lady's psychic voice carried a note of something approaching despair.
The Void Kraken has altered course and increased velocity.
Estimated arrival time now 41 hours.
All non-essential personnel are advised to evacuate the system immediately.
Marcus looked out the window and saw streams of spacecraft leaving Pyraxis's atmosphere, their engines creating brilliant streaks against the darkening sky. Below, the crowd around the ceremonial ground had thinned considerably as beings chose flight over the increasingly slim chance of success. "She's running out of time," Marcus observed.
"We all are,"
Zixtal replied grimly. "If that thing reaches a populated system and there's no one with sufficient power to stop it."
The implication was clear.
Void Krakens didn't just destroy worlds, they consumed the psychic energy of entire civilizations, leaving behind empty husks that retained the appearance of life but none of its substance.
A single Kraken could turn a thriving star system into a graveyard that would haunt the galaxy for millennia. Another group descended into the trial passage.
Marcus found himself hoping they would succeed, despite having seen the futility of every previous attempt.
Maybe this group would be different.
Maybe one of them had the specific psychological makeup needed to survive the revelation of infinite possibilities. 20 minutes later, the altar flickered and went dark for several seconds before grudgingly returning to its dim glow. When the passage opened, nothing emerged. The Dragon Lady's grief was palpable through the psychic link as she announced, "The trial has claimed all 6 volunteers.
Their courage will be remembered."
"This is madness," Marcus said, standing up abruptly. "She's just letting people destroy themselves for nothing."
"What choice does she have?"
Zixtal asked. "If she doesn't find an heir, the entire empire falls. Sometimes you have to choose between certain failure and a slim chance of success." Marcus paced to the window and back, his mind racing. There had to be another solution, some alternative that no one had considered. The Dragon Lady was ancient and powerful, but she was also bound by traditions and cosmic forces that might be clouding her judgment.
What if there's someone who could survive the trial but would never volunteer? Marcus asked suddenly. "What do you mean?" "Think about it.
Everyone who's attempted the trial so far has been either desperate or convinced of their own specialness.
What if the kind of person who could actually succeed would be too humble or too realistic to think they had a chance?"
Zixtal's compound eyes refracted the light as he considered this.
"That's an interesting theory, but how would you identify such a person? And how would you convince them to attempt something that appears to be suicide?"
Marcus didn't have an answer to that, but the question stuck with him as he watched another group prepare for the trial. These volunteers looked even more desperate than the previous ones, beings whose worlds were apparently already facing threats that made the risk of the trial seem acceptable. The results were as predictable as they were horrifying. As the night wore on and the Void Kraken drew closer, Marcus found himself thinking not about the cosmic forces and ancient powers involved, but about the basic human, or rather, sentient, psychology at play. The Dragon Lady was looking for someone who could maintain their identity when confronted with infinite possibility, but everyone attempting the trial was precisely the wrong type of person for that challenge. Heroes and glory seekers defined themselves through their exceptionalism.
Desperate people defined themselves through their circumstances.
Both types would be psychologically destroyed by discovering that they were simultaneously everything and nothing special.
What about someone who's already comfortable with the idea that they're not special? Marcus mused aloud. Meaning?
Someone who's already accepted that they're just one possibility among many, that their choices and experiences don't make them fundamentally different from anyone else. Someone who's already come to terms with their own ordinariness. Zixtal's mandibles clicked slowly.
That's actually a remarkably insightful analysis.
But finding such a person would be nearly impossible.
Most sentient beings spend their entire lives trying to establish their uniqueness.
Marcus nodded, but something was nagging at him. There was a piece of this puzzle that he was missing, some obvious solution that everyone was overlooking because they were too focused on the cosmic scale of the problem. It wasn't until he was preparing for bed that the realization hit him with the force of a revelation. He knew exactly the kind of person who might survive the trial of eternal flame. The question was whether he had the courage to do anything about it. Marcus spent the night staring at the ceiling, his mind churning through possibilities and implications. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the broken faces of the trial survivors, their minds shattered by revelations too vast for any normal consciousness to contain. But, alongside that horror, another image kept surfacing, his own reflection in the dormitory mirror.
Plain. Unremarkable.
A human exchange student who consistently earned average grades, had no particular talents, and whose greatest achievement was managing to avoid failing xenobiology. He was exactly the kind of person who would never in a million years consider himself capable of passing a trial that had destroyed princes and generals. Which, according to his own analysis, might be precisely why he could succeed. The logical part of his mind rejected the idea immediately. It was ego disguised as humility, the desperate fantasy of an ordinary person who wanted to believe he was secretly special. But another part of his mind, the part that had spent 2 years studying the psychology of different species and the nature of consciousness itself, whispered that the logic was sound.
The trial broke minds by showing them infinite possibility. But what if your sense of self wasn't dependent on being special? What if you'd already accepted that you were just one random configuration of matter and energy in an infinite universe?
Marcus had always found that idea comforting rather than terrifying. He was still wrestling with these thoughts when morning arrived, bringing with it news that made his personal crisis seem trivial by comparison. The Void Kraken had accelerated again, and long-range scans were now showing something that chilled the blood of every military analyst in the Empire. The creature wasn't alone.
3 more contacts detected, the emergency broadcasts announced.
Estimated arrival time for the primary entity now 28 hours.
Secondary entities expected within 40 hours.
Marcus looked out his window to see the ceremonial ground nearly empty. Only a handful of the most desperate or deranged beings remained, apparently still convinced that they could somehow succeed where everyone else had failed. The Dragon Lady stood at her platform like a statue, her form barely stable enough to maintain coherent shape. For Void Krakens, Zixtal said, his mandibles clicking with barely suppressed panic. That's not a random encounter, that's a coordinated assault.
Something's drawing them here deliberately. What could do that?
The trial itself, Zixtal replied grimly. The cosmic forces involved in maintaining it create exactly the kind of psychic resonance that Krakens feed on. The longer it runs without a successful candidate, the stronger the signal becomes. Marcus felt pieces clicking into place in his mind. So the Dragon Lady has to choose between finding an heir and stopping the signal that's attracting the Krakens. And, if she stops the trial to deal with the Krakens, she uses up the last of her power reserves fighting them. Either way, the Empire loses its protector. As they watched, another group of volunteers descended into the trial passage. There were only 3 of them this time, a desperate-looking Crystallian family whose homeworld had apparently been destroyed in a recent conflict. They carried themselves with the resigned air of beings who had nothing left to lose.
The results came back 15 minutes later, no survivors at all.
The Dragon Lady's grief was so intense that every psychically sensitive being on the planet felt it like a physical blow. Marcus found himself staggering backward from the window, his head ringing with secondhand anguish. She can't take much more of this, he said.
None of us can, Zixtal replied. Look.
Marcus followed his roommate's gaze to see something that made his heart sink. The Dragon Lady was beginning to collapse, not physically, but on a fundamental level. Her form was losing coherence, shifting between aspects so rapidly that she appeared to be multiple beings occupying the same space. The strain of maintaining the trial while watching it destroy everyone who attempted it was finally breaking down her ancient consciousness.
If she loses coherent form before finding an heir. Zixtal didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what that would mean.
Marcus made his decision. I have to try, he said quietly. Zixtal's compound eyes swiveled toward him with such speed that Marcus heard the joints click.
Try what? The trial. I have to attempt the trial. For a moment, Zixtal was silent.
Then, his mandibles began clicking so rapidly that his translator gave up trying to render it as speech and simply produced a continuous buzzing sound. Marcus, he said finally, I know you've been thinking about this, but you have to understand you're not qualified. You're not a warrior or a leader or a genius. You're just ordinary, Marcus finished.
I know. That's the point.
He quickly explained his theory about the trial's true nature and why conventional heroes were doomed to fail. Zixtal listened with growing understanding, his antennae twitching as he processed the implications. Even if you're right about the psychological requirements, Zixtal said when Marcus finished, the trial isn't just mental.
There are physical and spiritual components as well. The cosmic forces involved could destroy your body even if your mind survived intact.
Maybe, Marcus admitted.
But look at the alternative.
He gestured toward the window, where the dragon lady's form was now so unstable that she appeared to be a constantly shifting aurora of light and shadow. In less than 30 hours, 4 void krakens would arrive to find a defenseless planet and a broken empire. The death toll would be beyond calculation. Besides, Marcus continued, someone has to try who actually has a chance of succeeding. Everyone else is attempting the trial for the wrong reasons: glory, power, desperation. I'm the only person on this planet who's genuinely content with being nobody special. Zixtal stared at him for a long moment.
You're serious about this? Dead serious. Then, I'm coming with you. Marcus blinked in surprise. What? No, absolutely not. This is my stupid idea, and you'll need support, Zixtal interrupted. Someone to document what happens, to report back if things go wrong.
Besides, his mandibles clicked in what Marcus recognized as determined resolution. If you're right about this, then supporting your attempt is the most important thing anyone could do right now. Before Marcus could argue further, Zixtal was already moving toward the communication panel.
I'm sending a message to the ceremonial ground.
Official request for trial access. Wait, Marcus said, panic suddenly flaring in his chest. I need time to prepare. To think about this more. Time is the one thing we don't have, Zixtal replied firmly. Every hour we delay is another hour closer to the Kraken's arrival.
If you're going to do this, it has to be now.
The reply came back within minutes, delivered through the same psychic link the Dragon Lady had been using for official announcements. But, this time, her voice was different, weaker, more fragmented, as if the effort of communication was almost beyond her capabilities. Request acknowledged, she said, and Marcus could feel the surprise in her mental tone. Exchange student Marcus Chen of Terra and observer Zixtal of Vorth Prime are cleared for trial access.
Warning, current trial conditions show 97% casualty rate.
Marcus felt his knees go weak. She actually approved it. She's desperate enough to let anyone try, Zixtal observed. That should tell you how bad things have gotten. They made their way through the eerily quiet corridors of the academy and out into the streets of Pyraxis. The planet that had buzzed with excitement just 3 days ago now felt like a ghost town. Most of the population had evacuated, leaving behind empty buildings and automated systems that continued their functions for no one. The ceremonial ground was almost deserted when they arrived. A few officials remained at their posts, but their faces carried the hollow look of beings going through the motions while waiting for disaster. The Dragon Lady stood at her platform, but Marcus could barely recognize her as the same being who had radiated such power and authority just days before. Her form was now purely energy, shifting between patterns that hurt to look at directly. When she spoke, her words came through the psychic link fragmented and distorted, as if they were traveling through damaged equipment. Marcus Chen, she said, and hearing his name in that ancient voice sent chills down his spine.
You are unexpected. What drives you to attempt what has broken the greatest minds in the Empire?
Marcus walked slowly toward the altar, very aware that he was crossing a line from which there might be no return. When he spoke, his voice sounded steadier than he felt.
I think the trial might be asking the wrong question, Great Mother.
Everyone who's attempted it has tried to prove they're worthy of cosmic power. But maybe what it's really testing is whether someone can handle that power without being corrupted by it. The Dragon Lady's fragmented form seemed to focus on him more intently.
Explain.
Heroes and nobles define themselves through their exceptionalism, Marcus continued, the words flowing as his academic training took over.
When the trial shows them infinite possibility, it destroys their sense of unique identity.
But someone who's already accepted that they're not special, who's comfortable with being ordinary, they might be able to handle the revelation that they're simultaneously everything and nothing.
For a long moment, there was silence.
Then, the Dragon Lady's laughter echoed through the psychic link, not mocking, but genuinely delighted. You understand, she said, and, for the first time in days her voice carried notes of hope.
You actually understand what the trial demands. How did you arrive at this insight?
Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks.
Honestly? I've never thought I was special.
My whole life, I've been the kid who gets average grades, has average skills, and will probably end up with an average job. I used to think that was a flaw, but studying here has taught me that maybe it's just accurate.
And that doesn't distress you?
Why should it? The universe is vast and beautiful and strange, and I get to be part of it.
That's already more amazing than I have any right to expect.
The Dragon Lady was silent for so long that Marcus began to wonder if she'd somehow lost consciousness while maintaining her energy form. When she finally spoke, her words carried an undertone of something that might have been wonder. 3,000 years, she said. 3,000 years of watching the greatest beings in the galaxy destroy themselves trying to prove their worthiness for power. And the answer was to find someone who doesn't want it.
Marcus looked up at her fragmented form. I do want to help, though.
I want to try to save the Empire, not because I think I'm destined for greatness, but because it's the right thing to do.
Even knowing that failure means certain death?
Everyone dies eventually, Marcus replied with a shrug. At least this way, my life might actually matter for something. The Dragon Lady's energy form stabilized for a moment, coalescing into something recognizably humanoid. Her ancient eyes looked directly into his, and Marcus felt the full weight of her millennia-long existence pressing against his consciousness. Very well, Marcus Chen of Terra, she said formally.
You may attempt the trial of eternal flame.
But, know this, I believe you have a better chance of survival than anyone who has come before.
Do not let that belief pressure you.
The trial will show you truths about existence that no mortal mind was meant to comprehend. Stay true to who you are, and you may yet emerge whole. Marcus nodded and walked toward the altar, his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, he heard Zixtal's mandibles clicking rapidly, either encouragement or prayer, he couldn't tell which. As he placed his hand on the crystalline surface, Marcus felt the now familiar golden glow beginning to emanate from the depths below. The altar started to descend, revealing the passage that had swallowed so many before him. See you on the other side, he called back to Zixtal, trying to inject confidence he didn't feel into his voice. Then, the passage sealed above him, and Marcus Chen, average student, unremarkable human, cosmic nobody, descended alone into the heart of the trial of eternal flame. The golden light grew brighter as he descended, until it seemed to fill not just the passage but every cell of his body. And, somewhere in that light, something vast and ancient and utterly alien turned its attention toward him. The passage ended in a chamber that defied every law of physics Marcus had ever learned. It was simultaneously vast and intimate, ancient and newly born, filled with golden light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls, if they could be called walls, showed glimpses of distant galaxies and microscopic particles of past and future moments stretching across eternity. At the center of the chamber stood a figure that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. It was himself. Not a reflection or a hologram, but another Marcus Chen, wearing clothes he'd never owned and bearing scars he'd never received. This other Marcus looked older, more confident, and, when he turned to face the newcomer, his eyes held depths of knowledge that spoke of years spent among the stars.
Hello, the other Marcus said calmly. I suppose you're wondering what's happening here.
Marcus found his voice after several attempts.
You're one of the possible versions, aren't you? One of the paths I could have taken.
One of infinite paths, the other Marcus confirmed. I'm the version of you who joined the Stellar Navy instead of going to university.
I've been waiting here for quite some time, actually.
The trial needed someone to explain the rules. Before Marcus could ask what that meant, the chamber around them began to shift and expand. New figures appeared, dozens of them, then hundreds, then thousands. All of them were Marcus Chen, but each was different in some fundamental way. There was Marcus the scientist, who had devoted his life to unlocking the secrets of quantum mechanics.
Marcus the artist, whose sculptures adorned museums across the galaxy.
Marcus the soldier, scarred by battles and wars that had never happened in this timeline.
Marcus the father, surrounded by children who would never be born. Marcus the villain, whose eyes glowed with malevolent power.
Marcus the saint, whose very presence seemed to radiate peace and compassion. This is what breaks most minds, the Navy Marcus explained as the infinite versions continued to multiply around them. They see all these possibilities and try to choose which one is real. They fragment trying to be everything simultaneously, or they despair realizing they're just one arbitrary choice among infinite alternatives. Marcus looked around at the countless versions of himself, feeling a strange sense of calm rather than the terror he'd expected.
But they're all real, aren't they? In some sense, I mean. In every sense, Navy Marcus confirmed with approval.
Each choice creates a new branch of reality, a new version of you experiencing a new set of possibilities.
The question the trial asks is simple: can you accept that truth without losing your sense of self? As if in response to his words, the chamber around them exploded into even greater complexity.
Now Marcus could see not just alternate versions of himself, but alternate versions of everyone he'd ever known. There was Zixtal the warrior, Zixtal the poet, Zixtal the mad scientist whose experiments had destroyed his homeworld. There was his mother as a space pirate, his father as an emperor, his childhood friend Sarah as both a savior and destroyer of civilizations. "It's beautiful," Marcus said softly, and meant it. Navy Marcus looked surprised.
Most people find it terrifying.
Why?
It's just everything that could be. It doesn't make any single reality less meaningful. If anything, it makes them all more precious because they're each unique contributions to the infinite tapestry.
The golden light around them intensified, and Marcus felt something vast pressing against his consciousness. Not malevolent, but testing, probing to see how he would react when the full weight of cosmic truth settled on his mind. Images flooded through him then, not just of himself, but of every possible configuration of matter and energy that could exist. He saw universes where physics worked differently, where life had never emerged, where consciousness had evolved into forms so alien that his human mind could barely process them. He experienced being a star burning for billions of years, a grain of sand on a beach, a single thought in the mind of an entity spanning galaxies. And, through it all, somehow, he remained Marcus Chen.
How?
Navy Marcus asked, his voice filled with wonder.
How are you staying coherent through this?
Marcus thought about that as he experienced being simultaneously a virus and a planet, a moment of time and an eternal constant. I think it's because I never thought I was special to begin with, he said slowly. If you define yourself as the hero or the genius or even the failure, then seeing infinite versions of yourself destroys that definition. But if you define yourself as just you, whatever that means in any given moment, then you can be all these things without contradiction. The testing presence pressed deeper, showing him versions of himself as a mass murderer, a coward, a being of pure evil who destroyed worlds for entertainment. Marcus felt the weight of these realities, the knowledge that under different circumstances, with different choices, he could have become any of these things.
And that doesn't horrify you? Navy Marcus asked.
Marcus considered the question seriously as he watched himself commit atrocities across 1,000 different timelines. It's sad, he said finally. All those versions of me who never learned to be better, who never had the chances or influences that kept me on a good path.
But they're still me, in some sense.
And if I can acknowledge that capacity for darkness without being consumed by it, maybe I can use that knowledge to make better choices. The golden light around them began to pulse with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, and Marcus realized that the trial was approaching its climax. All around him, the infinite versions of reality swirled in a cosmic dance that was simultaneously chaotic and perfectly ordered. Final test, Navy Marcus said, his form beginning to fade along with all the other versions. The trial will offer you the power to choose which reality becomes real. You could eliminate all the dark possibilities, make yourself the hero of every story, ensure that only the best outcomes ever occur.
Will you accept that responsibility?
Marcus felt the offer settle into his mind like a weight beyond measurement. The power to edit reality itself, to ensure that suffering never existed, that every choice led to the best possible outcome. It was the ultimate temptation for anyone who had seen the full scope of what could be. No, he said without hesitation. The testing presence seemed surprised by the immediacy of his response. Through the psychic link that connected all things in this space, Marcus felt it asking why. Because it wouldn't be real, Marcus explained. Beauty and meaning come from the fact that good choices matter precisely because bad ones are possible. If you eliminate all the darkness, you eliminate the context that makes light precious. Besides, he added with a slight smile, who am I to decide which versions of reality get to exist? They're all valid experiences of consciousness exploring what it means to be. The golden light exploded outward then, carrying Marcus through a transition that felt like being born and dying simultaneously. When his vision cleared, he found himself back in the chamber, but it had changed. The infinite possibilities were still there, but now they felt like a library he could access rather than a chaos threatening to overwhelm him. A new figure approached, not another version of himself, but the presence that had been testing him, now wearing a form that his mind could comprehend. It appeared as an ancient being of living flame, beautiful and terrible and older than the stars themselves. You have passed, it said, its voice carrying harmonics that spoke directly to his soul. You have seen the true nature of existence and remained yourself. You understand that power is not about controlling possibilities, but about accepting them while still choosing to act with wisdom and compassion. Marcus felt power flowing into him then, not the raw cosmic force he had expected, but something more subtle and profound. It was the ability to see the connections between all things, to understand the consequences of actions across infinite timelines, to hold contradictory truths without losing his essential humanity.
What am I now? He asked.
What you always were, the presence replied.
Marcus Chen, average student, unremarkable human. The difference is that now you understand why that's exactly what the universe needed.
The chamber began to dissolve around him, but, before the transition completed, the presence spoke once more, the void kraken's approach, drawn by the psychic emanations of this trial. You now have the power to face them, but, remember, your strength comes not from being special, but from being willing to do what's necessary without needing to be special. The golden light enveloped Marcus completely, carrying him upward through the passage and back toward a world that was about to discover whether an ordinary human could save an empire. As consciousness faded, his last thought was a simple one: he really hoped he didn't mess this up. When Marcus opened his eyes, he was lying on the ceremonial ground with Zixtal hovering anxiously over him. The dragon lady stood nearby, her form now stable and coherent for the first time in days. But what drew Marcus's attention immediately was the change in the sky. It was no longer the familiar three-sun arrangement he'd grown used to. For massive shadows were approaching from the edge of the system, their forms so vast that they were visible to the naked eye despite still being hours away. The void krakens had arrived early.
How long was I gone?
Marcus asked, sitting up and immediately regretting it as his head spun. 6 hours, Zixtal replied, his relief evident in the rapid clicking of his mandibles.
We were starting to think, well, that you weren't coming back.
Marcus looked around at the ceremonial ground, noting the dragon lady's expectant expression and the way reality itself seemed somehow more vivid and interconnected than it had before. He could sense the approaching krakens now not just as physical threats, but as tears in the fabric of existence itself, wounds in the cosmic order that fed on psychic energy and left nothing but emptiness in their wake. Great Mother, he said formally, climbing to his feet.
I believe I have work to do.
The dragon lady smiled, the first genuine expression of joy Marcus had seen from her since the trials began.
Indeed you do, my successor. Indeed you do.
But, as Marcus looked up at the approaching shadows that dwarfed entire planets, he couldn't help but wonder if surviving the trial had been the easy part. The void krakens filled the sky like living nightmares, their forms defying easy description. Marcus could see them clearly now through his enhanced perception, creatures that existed partially outside normal spacetime, their massive tentacles reaching across dimensional barriers to feed on the psychic emanations of living worlds. Each one was easily the size of a small moon, and their approach was causing reality itself to ripple and distort. "They're beautiful, in a terrifying way," Marcus observed, surprising both himself and Zixtal with his calm tone.
"Beautiful?"
Zixtal's mandibles clicked nervously.
"They're about to devour our entire civilization."
"That too," Marcus admitted.
He could feel the Dragon Lady's ancient power flowing through him now, but it felt different than he'd expected.
Instead of overwhelming cosmic force, it was more like having access to a vast library of knowledge and experience. He understood instinctively what the Krakens were, how they fed, and, most importantly, how they could be stopped. The traditional approach would be to fight them with raw power, the Dragon Lady explained, her form now stable and radiant beside him. Strike them with cosmic fire, tear apart their physical manifestations through sheer force.
"It's how my ancestors dealt with such threats for millennia."
"But that won't work here," Marcus said, the knowledge flowing through him as if he'd always possessed it.
"These aren't normal Krakens. They're being coordinated by something else, something that's learned how to adapt to our usual defenses."
Through his enhanced perception, Marcus could see the truth of the situation. The 4 Krakens weren't acting independently, they were connected by streams of dark energy to something much larger, something that lurked in the spaces between realities. A master Kraken, ancient beyond measure, that had been observing the Draconic Empire's defenses for centuries and had finally devised a way to breach them. "It's been waiting," Marcus realized aloud. "Waiting for you to be weakened by maintaining the trial, waiting for the perfect moment when your power reserves were too low to fight effectively." The Dragon Lady's expression darkened.
"Then, we are truly lost."
"I have perhaps enough strength remaining for one major working, but if that fails to stop them..."
"It won't stop them," Marcus interrupted gently.
"Because fighting them directly is exactly what it expects us to do." He turned to face the approaching threat, feeling the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on his shoulders. Strange to think that just days ago his biggest concern had been passing his xenobiology exam. Now he was expected to save an empire that spanned 1,000,000 worlds. "So what do you propose?" the Dragon Lady asked. Marcus closed his eyes, letting his enhanced perception expand outward until he could sense the full scope of the approaching threat.
The Master Kraken was vast, larger than some star systems, and its intelligence was alien but undeniably brilliant.
It had spent centuries studying the Empire's defenses, learning from each previous Kraken that had been destroyed, adapting its tactics accordingly. But there was something it couldn't understand, because its intelligence was predicated on a fundamental assumption that Marcus had learned to see past.
"It thinks power is about domination," Marcus said, opening his eyes.
"About imposing your will on reality through force. That's how it's always worked, how every cosmic entity throughout history has operated. But that's not what real power is."
"Then, what is it?"
Zixtal asked. Marcus smiled, feeling surprisingly calm as the shadows of the approaching Krakens began to darken the sky above them.
"Real power is understanding that you don't need to control everything to protect what matters."
He reached out with his enhanced senses, not toward the Krakens themselves, but toward the space between them and Pyraxis. In that empty void, he could feel the Master Kraken's influence, streams of psychic energy that connected it to its servants, commands flowing back and forth across impossible distances. The traditional response would be to try to sever those connections through brute force. But Marcus had learned something in the trial that no other heir apparent in 3,000 years had discovered: sometimes the most effective action is the one that seems like inaction. Instead of attacking the psychic streams, Marcus reached out and gently touched them. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Master Kraken. Its alien intelligence, evolved over eons to expect resistance and conflict, suddenly found itself connected to a mind that offered no resistance at all. Marcus didn't fight the creature's influence, he simply allowed it to flow through him while maintaining his essential identity.
The Master Kraken's confusion was palpable through the psychic link.
It had encountered every form of cosmic defense imaginable: walls of fire, shields of pure will, maze-like mental constructs designed to trap and confuse intruders. But it had never encountered a mind that simply accepted its presence without being consumed by it. "What are you doing?" the Dragon Lady asked, alarm creeping into her voice as she sensed the connection forming. "Learning," Marcus replied simply. "It wants to understand our defenses so it can overcome them." so I'm showing it exactly how our defenses work. Through the psychic link, Marcus opened his consciousness completely to the Master Kraken's inspection. He showed it the full scope of the Draconic Empire's power, the cosmic forces that the Dragon Lady could command, the ancient weapons and defenses that protected a million worlds. The Master Kraken devoured this information eagerly, its alien satisfaction radiating through the link as it analyzed each defense and formulated countermeasures. But, as it did so, it began to encounter something it couldn't process or understand.
Marcus's ordinariness.
The creature's intelligence was vast and ancient, capable of comprehending cosmic forces and manipulating reality across galactic distances. But, it had never encountered a mind that genuinely didn't consider itself special, that held cosmic power while maintaining the essential humility of someone who knew they were just one possibility among infinite alternatives. "You're confusing it," the Dragon Lady observed with growing amazement.
"It can't categorize you."
"Because I don't fit any of the patterns it's learned to recognize," Marcus confirmed. "Every cosmic entity it's ever encountered has been defined by their power, their specialness, their conviction that they were fundamentally different from ordinary beings."
"But, I'm not." The Master Kraken's confusion was rapidly turning to something approaching panic. Its entire understanding of cosmic hierarchy was based on the assumption that power came from transcending ordinary existence.
But, here was a being who wielded the full might of the Draconic Empire while remaining essentially unchanged from the average student who had attempted the trial. Through the psychic link, Marcus could feel the creature trying to understand the paradox.
How could someone hold cosmic power without being corrupted by it? How could someone see infinite possibility without losing their essential identity? How could someone be simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary?
"The answer," Marcus said, speaking now to the Master Kraken directly through the link, "is that those aren't contradictions at all.
Extraordinary is just ordinary looked at from a different perspective. Power is just responsibility wearing fancy clothes.
And specialness, well, specialness is just the story we tell ourselves to feel better about being exactly what we are." The Master Kraken's response was a psychic shriek that resonated across multiple dimensions. Its alien intelligence, evolved to understand and overcome every form of cosmic defense, simply couldn't process a mind that held ultimate power while remaining genuinely humble. The four servant Krakens, suddenly, deprived of coherent commands from their master, began to drift aimlessly through space. Without the Master Kraken's coordination, they reverted to their base nature, simple predators seeking the easiest sources of psychic energy. "They're leaving," Zixtal observed, his voice filled with wonder.
"They're actually leaving."
Marcus nodded, watching through his enhanced perception as the confused creatures turned away from Paraxis and began moving toward the outer system. "They'll find some uninhabited worlds to feed on, probably sleep for a few centuries while they digest."
"No threat to anyone." "And the Master Kraken?"
Marcus considered the alien presence still connected to his consciousness, its vast intelligence now trapped in recursive loops as it tried to understand how it had been defeated without actually being fought. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "it's going to spend a very long time trying to figure out what just happened. And, maybe, eventually, it'll learn something useful from the experience." The Dragon Lady was staring at him with an expression of profound amazement. "In 3,000 years of ruling this empire," she said, "I have never seen anything like what you just accomplished." Marcus shrugged, the gesture feeling perfectly natural despite the cosmic forces still flowing through him.
"I just did what made sense.
Fighting something that powerful would have been stupid, especially when there was an easier way."
"Easier?"
Zixtal's mandibles clicked in disbelief.
"You just psychically connected with a cosmic entity that could have destroyed your mind in seconds." "Could it, though?" Marcus asked genuinely.
"I mean, the trial showed me every possible version of myself, including versions that were cosmic entities themselves. If I can accept being simultaneously a mass murderer and a saint, being a student and an emperor, then, I suppose I can accept being both ordinary and cosmically powerful." The Dragon Lady stepped forward, her ancient eyes reflecting depths of approval and something that might have been relief. "Marcus Chen of Terra," she said formally, "you have not only passed the trial of eternal flame but proven yourself worthy of powers that I myself have never fully understood.
Will you accept the formal role of heir to the Draconic Empire?"
Marcus thought about that for a moment, considering what such a position would mean. Responsibility for a million worlds, decisions that would affect the lives of trillions of beings, the weight of cosmic power that could reshape reality itself.
Only if I can still be Marcus Chen, he said finally.
Average student, unremarkable human, cosmic nobody who happened to get lucky.
Because I think that's actually the most important qualification for the job.
The dragon lady smiled, not the ancient, terrible smile of a cosmic entity, but the warm, approving smile of someone who had found exactly what they were looking for.
I think you understand the nature of power better than any being I've encountered in 3 millennia, she said. Yes, Marcus Chen. You may certainly still be yourself.
In fact, I suspect that's precisely why you'll be a better ruler than any of us ever imagined possible. As the immediate crisis passed and the crowds began to return to Pyraxis, Marcus found himself thinking about the strange path that had brought him here. A few days ago, he'd been worried about failing his exams. Now he was the heir to an empire that spanned the galaxy.
But, somehow, he didn't feel fundamentally different.
He was still Marcus Chen, still the same person who found the universe beautiful and vast and stranger than any one mind could fully comprehend. He just happened to have cosmic powers now, which was admittedly pretty cool, but didn't change who he was at his core.
So what happens next?
Zixtal asked, settling into a comfortable position beside his roommate as they watched the celebration beginning in the streets below.
I suppose I learn how to be an heir to an empire, Marcus replied.
Probably lots of meetings and formal ceremonies and people expecting me to have opinions about things I've never thought about before.
And the cosmic powers?
Marcus considered that, feeling the vast reservoir of knowledge and ability that now flowed through him.
I'll use them when they're needed, he said.
But I think the most important thing I can do is remember that having power doesn't make you special, it just makes you responsible for using it wisely. The dragon lady approached them as the celebration continued around the ceremonial ground.
There will be time for formal training later, she said.
But, for now, I think you should know that what you accomplished today will be remembered for millennia. You saved not just the empire, but provided a new model for how cosmic power can be wielded.
What do you mean?
For 3,000 years, every being who wielded ultimate power did so by transcending their original nature, by becoming something fundamentally different from what they started as. You're the first to prove that it's possible to hold cosmic responsibility while remaining essentially unchanged. She paused, her ancient features thoughtful. I suspect this will change how power is understood.